I'm going to be talking with all of you today about the Western media as culprits of complicity in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. But first, I want to recognise the work of the brave Palestinian journalists and media workers who've been working tirelessly to bring us news on the reality on the ground in Gaza. And I just want to take a minute for us just in silence to honour those who've been martyred, along with the nearly 40,000 other Palestinians who've been slaughtered in this brutal genocide. So just bear with me for a minute. Thank you for that. Since the beginning of this genocide in Gaza, Israeli regime bombardments and forces have killed upwards of 100 Palestinian journalists and media workers. I think that number is probably outdated now. But in 2023 alone, 70% of all journalists killed all around the world were Palestinians. And many of these individuals were killed as they were actively working to share the ongoing atrocities with the world. Others were targeted in their homes, their families murdered alongside them. Now, despite these deliberate and brutal attacks and these surrounding catastrophic conditions, hundreds of journalists and media workers continue their coverage and reporting. And it's really, as I mentioned earlier, it's really thanks to them that we're seeing what's happening on the ground, and that we are actually able to challenge the narratives of mainstream Western media, which by and large provide cover to the Israeli regime. And we've seen mainstream Western media coverage of the genocide highlight not only the deep biases in favor of the Israeli regime, but also the ease in which Palestinians have been dehumanized. And I think that's really been something that's quite striking. A former UN human rights official, Craig Mochaber, noted that intent is often the hardest thing to prove in a genocide. And in the case of Israel's assault on Gaza, the opposite has actually been true. Palestinian dehumanization is a clear tactic that's being deployed. And to justify this intense and cruel violence on the people, first they have to be unpeople. So since the beginning of the genocide, there have been numerous official statements and interviews and social media posts by Israeli ministers and politicians. I'm sure you've seen some of these. And these really demonstrate the widespread dehumanization of Palestinians. So much so that they were actually used as part of South Africa's case against the Israeli regime at the International Court of Justice as examples of genocidal intent. So, for example, President Isaac Herzog of the Israeli Labour Party said in reference to the Hamas operation on the 7th of October, he said, "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible." He was later photographed autographing bombs that would be dropped on Gaza. And this is a popular trend for Israeli politicians and celebrities in Israeli society. Benny Gantz, a war cabinet minister and longtime opposition candidate to Netanyahu, said, "The fighting will continue and expand to any place necessary in the Gaza Strip. There will be no sanctuary cities." And actually last week, Benny Gantz made a renewed call for Israeli elections, general elections in September. And he stated clearly that it would not disrupt the military effort, but rather renew trust in the government among its citizens. So in other words, he's calling for a new leadership, not a ceasefire, not an end to the genocide, but rather a new leadership that would continue the genocide. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant referred to Palestinians as human animals. I'm sure you heard that one. And the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said a lot. He said I think one of the most telling things was when he described the genocide as a struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle. And I think it goes without saying that all of this language is deeply rooted in racism, in colonial dominance. And we've seen throughout history similar language used in South Africa, for example, where the white minority, how the white minority talked about the black majority by the British colonialists in reference to Indians, and more broadly by settler colonialists all over the world in reference to indigenous people. And I think what's important to note is that this language being used by Israeli politicians and ministers doesn't belong to the fringe right-wing Israeli politicians in the current coalition government. I mentioned some of their political affiliations to highlight that point. So Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president is of the Labour Party. Benny Gantz, who is the opposition candidate to Netanyahu, is a so-called centrist. And they're all using this discourse of racist dehumanization and genocidal intent. And much of this discourse is actually shared and repeated by much of the Israeli population. There was actually a recent poll that showed 88% of Israeli Jewish citizens think that the number of Palestinians killed has been justified. Need I not remind you all that we're looking at upwards of 40,000 Palestinians killed. Some 43% of Israeli Jewish citizens believe that the army is not using enough firepower, even though in January alone it was estimated that the equivalent of 3 Hiroshima nuclear bombs have been dropped on Gaza. Israeli doctors have signed letters calling for the destruction of hospitals in Gaza, and an Israeli hip-hop duo's song calling for genocide made it to #1 in the Israeli charts. The genocide in Gaza has taken Israeli society by storm in ways that one can't even imagine. And this also includes Israeli soldiers on the ground in Gaza. The embrace of Palestinian dehumanization by Israeli soldiers has resulted in this particularly gruesome phenomenon of what I call snuff videos. In these videos, soldiers can be seen often gleefully committing war crimes against Palestinians and referring to them as subhuman. There's one video where an Israeli soldier dresses up in a dinosaur costume, loads artillery shells into a tank and dances as the shells are fired in the direction of Gaza. In another video, a soldier is filmed dedicating an explosion to his 2-year-old daughter for her birthday. Seconds later, a Palestinian residential building behind them is blown up. Another video shows Israeli soldiers setting alight Palestinian food supplies during an enforced starvation campaign. And then, of course, there are hundreds of videos of Israeli soldiers mocking Palestinian civilians who've been stripped, rounded up, and blindfolded. Now, there has been shock and outrage over these videos on social media platforms by Palestinians and their allies, of course. Though there have been those in the mainstream media as well who've criticized them. I think many have noted that these can be used as further evidence in the case against the Israeli regime at the International Court of Justice. But even those who are pro-Israel, who support the Israeli regime, seem to be alarmed by the brazenness with which Israeli soldiers are sharing these videos. Piers Morgan, for example, apologies in advance for quoting him, he said, "Why do Israeli soldiers keep filming themselves doing these kind of crass, insensitive things? Why don't their commanders stop them? It makes them look callous when so many children in Gaza are being killed." So for Morgan, it seems that the problem is not that the soldiers are doing these things, but rather that they are showing the world what they're doing. And I think some have questioned how Israeli soldiers could stoop so low. How can we reach these levels of cruelty? And I think we have to recall that dehumanization paves the way for this kind of behavior with ease. When Palestinians are seen as less than human, their acts become far more palatable. these acts become far more palatable. So both for the soldiers themselves as well as the intended audience. And I think, for those less familiar with the context, they also might find it strange that these soldiers are implicating themselves in such horrific crimes without hesitation. But I think it's important to remember that decades of impunity, not only for the Israeli regime, but also for Israeli individuals guilty of war crimes, has led us to the point where a genocide is being visually documented by the perpetrators. Now, I think it's not been surprising that Palestinian dehumanization by Israeli politicians and soldiers has largely gone unchallenged by Western mainstream media. It's actually been widely regurgitated. A rather explicit example of this is a New York Times column by Thomas Friedman. And again, apologies for quoting all these nasty individuals. But he wrote a piece titled "Understanding the Middle East Through the Animal Kingdom." And in his opinion piece, Friedman likens whole populations in the region to various insects, whilst equating the US to a lion. And he ends the column by stating, "Sometimes I contemplate the Middle East by watching CNN. Other times I prefer Animal Planet." And there are also plenty of examples from British media outlets where Palestinians and the Arabs are treated as subhuman and not deserving of the same sympathy for the loss of loved ones. So aside from the simple repetition of Israeli regime talking points, Western mainstream media readily adopts a number of additional elements involved in Palestinian dehumanization. And perhaps the most obvious among them is the language of the war on terrorism. So situating the context as this sort of fight between good and evil, or between West and East. And it's a discourse that demonizes and devalues Arabs, brown bodies, as these homogenous mass of uncivilized, violent hordes waiting to invade Western civilization. And the most obvious use of this framework is in the reporting of the October 7th Hamas operation. And I'm sure you all saw this, but shortly after October 7th, there were various editorials that ran with phrases such as murderous rampage, bloodthirsty attack. International journalists and outlets lapped up the comparisons of ISIS and all the gruesome stories that were emanating from Israeli security forces. Stories that would actually later be debunked by the Israeli media. Descriptors such as murderous, bloodthirsty, barbaric, and uncivilized are clearly reserved for Palestinians. Nowhere can those terms be found applied to Israeli regime forces, despite the slaughter of over 40,000 Palestinians over the course of 6 months. And such selective dehumanization has become standard practice at leading media outlets. And this is exemplified by a letter from a team of BBC journalists who accuse their employer of applying a double standard in how civilians are seen, and of positioning Hamas as the only instigator and perpetrator of violence in the region. Now, the adoption of the war on terror discourse also involves incessant references to Hamas, a movement designated as a terrorist organization by most Western governments, when reporting on public infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, and factories. So anything that is government operated or government run in Gaza becomes Hamas affiliated, and therefore a legitimate target. And it's an effective tactic. Indeed, if you reduce an entire society to one that is terrorist run, then the war crimes against the population within it become easy to justify. And this has been particularly the case with the hospitals in Gaza, which are often labeled by the Western media as Hamas run. I'm sure you've all heard, the numbers by the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. And this is, of course, deliberately done to delegitimize these institutions, to question the use of the hospitals. And of course, this rhetoric is solely reserved for Gaza and for Palestinians. Israeli public hospitals and schools are never referred to as Likud run. Have you ever heard a BBC presenter ask an Israeli official about a Likud run school or a Likud run hospital? It doesn't happen. Another dehumanizing tactic that has been particularly insidious is that of unchilding Palestinian children. Now, unchilding is a concept developed by Professor Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, which I think some of you may have heard of recently. She was temporarily suspended from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem for her opposition, her vocal opposition to the genocide. Professor Nadira describes unchilding as the transformation and construction of colonized children as dangerous, racialized others, enabling their eviction from the realm of childhood itself. So in other words, Palestinian children are classified as adults to justify violence committed against them. And this is something that we've long seen in the Western mainstream media's treatment of Palestinian children, but I think it has become more blatant since October 2023. For decades, Palestinian children have been referred to as potential militants, potential terrorists, as a way to justify their systematic killing and imprisonment across Palestinian land. But the scale of unchilding in this ongoing genocide has been unprecedented and parallels the unprecedented scale of the amount of children being killed. The number of children that have been killed in Gaza, I think, is probably something like 13 or 14,000. It amounts to more than all child fatalities in over 4 years of global conflict combined. So I just want to give you a couple of examples of unchilding in the mainstream media. In November 2023, a Guardian article stated that Israeli women and children would be exchanged for Palestinian prisoners who are women and people aged 18 and younger. So in this case, Israeli children were afforded their protected status as children, whilst Palestinian children were denied that same status. In response to this particular report, Bissan, a storyteller and journalist in Gaza, asked, "Are our children less children than theirs?" Similarly, during the exchange of hostages and Palestinian political prisoners, it was commonplace to see Palestinian children referred to as teenagers or minors. Now, these terms may technically be accurate, but I think their use is a deliberate tactic. It's intended to strip Palestinian children of their childness, making their lives and suffering less grievable. Perhaps most egregious of all was in January 2024, a Sky News broadcaster reported that accidentally a stray bullet found its way into the van that killed a 3 or 4-year-old young lady. Now, this young lady was a 3 or 4-year-old girl. Her name was Raqayya, and she was shot in the back by Israeli regime forces while sitting in the backseat of a shared taxi near an Israeli military checkpoint in the occupied West Bank. Now, a final indication of media bias that I want to point out in the context of Palestine is the complete disregard for journalistic rigor and the perpetuation of Israeli disinformation. And I think this was most clearly seen in the aftermath of October 7th, where journalists from major mainstream platforms such as CNN, France 24, The Independent, wildly reported on a story of Hamas fighters beheading 40 babies in Kfar Aza settlement. Despite this being quickly debunked, including by Israeli officials, many journalists failed to retract their original reporting, at best issuing a clarification that the allegations could not be confirmed. The widespread reporting of such a detrimental, horrific story without photographic evidence or other means to independently verify the claims speaks to the ongoing tendency for Western media to peddle Israeli disinformation without scrutiny. The failure of journalists to apply rigorous fact-checking was also apparent in the reporting of the bombing of the Al-Ahli hospital. News outlets were quick to adopt the Israeli regime's version of events, which erroneously claimed that the hospital was hit by a misfired Palestinian militant rocket. A series of fabricated evidence released by the Israeli regime was also not scrutinized until much later. Independent organizations, including Forensic Architecture, conducted their own investigations and came to the same conclusions that Palestinians have been contending all along, that the Israeli regime was lying. Now, since the bombing of the Al-Ahli hospital, all the healthcare infrastructure and hospitals have been attacked in Gaza and pretty much rendered inoperable by the Israeli regime forces. The Western media has by and large failed to report on this systematic strategy to devastate Palestinian healthcare in Gaza. Now, in February 2024, a Guardian report highlighted this pattern of institutional bias as demonstrated at CNN, where anonymous staffers argued that the news channel's reporting on Palestine amounts to journalistic malpractice. And the report actually revealed that not only are journalists obliged to give prominence to stories of Israeli officials, they likewise face significant restrictions on reporting Palestinian perspectives and quoting Hamas representatives. So one CNN employee said, "It's okay for us to be embedded with the Israeli military, producing reports censored by the army, but we cannot talk to the organization that won the majority of the votes in Gaza, whether we like it or not. CNN viewers are being prevented from hearing from a central player in this story." Now, The Guardian reports that the CNN Senior Director of News Standards and Practices issued a directive in early November 2023 that effectively banned the reporting of most Hamas statements, characterizing them as inflammatory rhetoric and propaganda. And indeed, the absence of first-hand statements from Hamas in Western media platforms is glaring. They're not invited for interviews, and their reports and statements are not analysed. Such a directive results in a one-sided depiction of the context and entirely ignores one of the key actors involved. And I think it must be understood that the consequences of the Western media's complicity in Palestinian dehumanization and spread of Israeli propaganda is not simply relegated to this narrative epistemological realm. These biases actually have serious material implications for Palestinians in Gaza and beyond. And so I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the Western media is complicit in the ongoing genocide that's being committed. And I think it's also important to say that these harmful outlets stand in direct contrast to the brave Palestinian journalists in Gaza who continue to risk their lives to cover the ongoing genocide and share the reality on the ground with the rest of the world. I'll stop there.